Dear colleagues, the European Academy of Science and Arts, in collaboration with the Hellenic Blue Seal Committee, with the endorsement of the Hungarian National Commission for UNESCO and the academic partnership of the Heritage Science University of Ljubljana, warmly welcomes you to our international online colloquium on how new technologies, ethics, and global cooperation can safeguard humanity's cultural heritage in times of crisis. Today it is the fourth colloquium, and I will coordinate this time. We have three speakers, all members of our academy, class 1 and class 4, and I would like to invite co-organizer and trustees, whoever is present, to greet this event and continue with the speaker and discussion. Let me start, however, with the president of our academy, who is always present in this colloquia, Professor Meinzer, to say a few words.
Yeah, thank you very much, Johannes. And as president of the European Academy of Sciences and Arts, my pleasure again to open this remarkable series. And thanks to Johannes LIRITZIS as coordinator. And this evening he invited the three members of our academy. I think this evening the topic is very serious. We will consider the cultural heritage in times of wars. And you all know we are living in times of war. Recently there was a threat in politics, you remember, to destroy civilization. To destroy a civilization, that is the vocabulary of the last World War, and which started, perhaps you remember, in 1937. There was this terrible German attack against Guernica in Spain, and it a cultural center, unbelievable. It was this event was highlighted in the famous painting of Pablo Picasso. And then in 1940, with the German attack to England, the St. Michael's Cathedral in Coventry was completely destroyed, and a new word, vocabulary, was invented in German, Coventrieren. That means something in English like to Coventry, to destroy a cultural center completely. But then in the end of the Second World War, these wonderful, magnificent, Baroque metropolis in the south east of Germany, Dresden, was completely destroyed, and the population were burned down. And then you remember in Nagasaki, a cultural center of Japan was completely destroyed, and Hiroshima. But let us not forget, in 1944, a remarkable event, namely the complete destruction of one of the spiritual and cultural centers in the Christian Middle Ages. That was Abbey Monte Cassino. And Monte Cassino was destroyed by military stupidity, by the Allied bombers, because they did not realize that there was no any soldier in the abbey. And so we can ask nowadays, can we prevent that in future, perhaps by drones or by artificial intelligence or iron domes like in Israel? But what about the poor people who are living in that region, the children and women in Tehran and in Jerusalem? Now, a more pleasant, I think, topic today is the last topic concerning the smell, the protection of smell in cultural heritage. And We all remember this wonderful smell. Especially, I remember the smell in Greece or in the Mediterranean regions in Italy and in Spain, or the smell in an old book in a library, or in a cathedral, or in a temple or mosque. Now, perhaps what is possible here again with artificial intelligence, AI, that's my field. I remember olfactory abilities of robots. I don't know, and so I'm very eager to learn more this evening about all that. And I wish us all an exciting discussion. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Klaus. Thank you very much. The Emerita Director General of Antiquities and Cultural Heritage, Minister of Culture, Greece, and President of Hellenic Blue Seal, Dr. Elena Korka. Please, Elena.
Tonight is a very special evening for the Hellenic Committee of the Blue Shield, which endorses this wonderful work that the European Academy of Sciences and Arts undertook, which is to organize a series of seminars regarding the protection of cultural heritage, its environment, in times of peace, in times of war, and how the broader sense of its protection can be advanced through new technologies. So tonight, as the first speaker is our chair, the president of the International Blue Shield, Peter Stone, is with us. It is a great honor for us to support these series of colloquia. I think it is always a privilege to hear the unique experience of Peter Stone regarding the field itself of protection of cultural heritage and how this is affected in time of war and what we should do in times of peace. Of course, the other themes that we will hear about are also of great importance because we can see how archaeometry is used in the field and how it can help us protect our cultural heritage and safeguard it for the future and the future generations. I really think that such a combination of experts in various fields is very positive and offers very much for the broader knowledge of these issues. And I really look forward to hearing our speakers tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Helena. And we go straight away to Peter Stone, the first speaker, UNESCO Chair in Cultural Property Protection and Peace at Newcastle University, President of Blue Shield International UK, with the title Saving Heritage in Armed Conflict, the Blue Shield and New Technologies. Professor Stone is a new member of our Academy and is a leading international authority on cultural property protection in times of armed conflict and crisis. Through his work with Blue Shield International and UNESCO-related initiatives, he has played a major role in advancing the protection of cultural heritage as part of peace building, international law, and humanitarian responsibility. His lecture will address how new technologies can support the identification, monitoring, and safeguarding the heritage at risk. Please, Peter, the podium is yours.
IOANNIS, thank you very much indeed. You will see on all of my slides two logos, the UNESCO chair at Newcastle and Blue Shield International. I have to say at the beginning of any presentation I do that I do not speak on behalf of UNESCO. The best definition I've heard of UNESCO chairs is that we are critical friends of UNESCO. And it has been pointed out to me on a couple of occasions that I may have been overly critical, but let's move on from that. I am allowed to talk about the Blue Shield as president of that organization. I'm not going to go through this slide in any detail at all, but it is just to flag that the whole idea of protecting cultural property is not new. It is at least 2,500 years old, and people have been trying to get the military and others to protect cultural property since the 6th century BCE with Sun Shao in China. That's all I'm going to say. But it's got a long gestation. Bringing that gestation a little bit closer, in the last 100 years, during the First World War, only about 18 months into the war, there was an idea to create a cultural protection organization during that conflict. There were conferences set up, discussions, meetings, and unfortunately nothing happened. But that was brought about because of the massive increase in the power of munitions, the type of warfare and the developing proximity to urban warfare, and of course the advent of aerial warfare. So nothing happened at the end of the First World War. At the end of the Second World War, the gentleman in the image, the then Director General of UNESCO, Yami Torres Bode, envisioned that they would create those who were brought together to draft what became the 1954 Hague Convention on the protection of cultural property in the event of armed conflict. Bode envisioned that they would also at the same time create what he called the Red Cross for cultural property. Sadly, nothing happened. And it was 42 years later in 1996 that 4 heritage organizations came together. So for archives, for museums, for monuments and sites, and for libraries to create the Blue Shield. But it was established not legally and with no funding. And it was essentially a heritage communication organization that came about because colleagues from those 4 organizations had met each other with some surprise in parts of the Balkans following the fighting in the former Yugoslavia. It wasn't until 2017, through my UNESCO chair at Newcastle University, that the Blue Shield first got some very limited funding, and the university paid for 2.5 staff, and it was those who provided a think tank, a secretariat, and an incubator for the Blue Shield. Since 2023, a sad reflection of the state of the world is that there has been more and more money available for people to try and protect cultural property during armed conflict, as a reflection of the number of conflicts happening around the world. It's from my perspective, positive that quite a lot of that money has been allocated to the work of the Blue Shield. So just as an indication of the increase in there, we have moved from about 50,000 euros in 2024 for project funding to, in 2025, 500,000 euros. So that's the type of development that we've got. But that, as I say, is project funding, not core funding for the organization. So why is cultural property protection important? And I just want to get this said and out of the way very quickly. Protect people first, always. We do not protect old things above people. But cultural property protection provides the tangible and intangible link to the past that helps to provide individuals and communities with a sense of place, identity, belonging, well-being, and dignity. And much of the well-being and dignity is indivisibly intertwined with their cultural property. And you have there in the images both tangible cultural property and intangible, a point I'll come back to in a moment, from Armenia and from Zimbabwe. So what we try to do as the Blue Shield is to protect cultural property, because by doing that, we can help either maintain or build healthy, peaceful, stable, secure, sustainable communities, the bedrock of peaceful societies. And when I talk about cultural property, I mean movable and immovable, tangible and intangible. And because they are Western constructs, both cultural and natural heritage, many parts of the world would dispute there is such a thing as natural heritage. And in the image there, you can see colleagues from Blue Shield Austria, helping to train colleagues from a newly established Blue Shield National Committee in Armenia. However, there is an issue. Cultural property, yes, defines who people are, but also, of course, and frequently contentiously, who they are not, who belongs and who does not belong, who is included and who is excluded. It can be used in a positive way as a vehicle for mutual understanding, recognition, and peace building. But it can also be used, and frequently has, unfortunately, as an excuse for conflict, a target and a weapon in conflict. And we must be aware of both and prepare for both. The image there is a salutary tale. It's the destruction in 2006 of the Al-Aqshiri Mosque in Samarra in Iraq. So 3 years after the coalition troops invaded, and they invaded with no political or military plans to protect any of the cultural property in Iraq. And you'll remember the media furore as the National Museum was looted on camera by many, and the American reaction that it really didn't matter. But it wasn't only the National Museum, the National Library, the National Archive, heritage sites across the country, museums and libraries across the country, and thousands, almost certainly tens of thousands of archaeological sites looted. And even 3 years later, the coalition still had not recognized the problem of not protecting heritage. And so it was very easy for an extreme Sunni group to go to the Al-Aqshiri Mosque in Samarra and blow it up. And that mosque, the third most holy place in Shia Islam. And that's seen as essentially a match thrown onto a problem that was a lot of dry kindling. The Iraqi population were increasingly fed up with coalition troops still being on their streets, still controlling their lives. And the destruction of the mosque was, as I say, a lit match thrown onto very dry wood, which tipped Iraq into the full-scale sectarian civil war that lasted for a further 5 years. And in coalition political minds, meaning that their forces had to stay in Iraq for a further 5 years, taking 5 years worth of casualties, of fatalities, but worse, if it can be worse, spending 5 years losing the propaganda war. And the loss of that propaganda war allowed for the re-emergence of an organization that Saddam Hussein had fairly robustly stamped out in Iraq, Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And it allowed for the oxygen for the emergence of the so-called Islamic State. Now, there isn't a direct and only line between the destruction of the Al-Aqshira Mosque and the emergence of those two, but there is a very firm dotted line between them. And if only heritage had been protected throughout that campaign, a lot less dangerous things might have happened. Neither of those organizations are going to go away in my lifetime. I can hope that they will have gone away in my grandchildren's lifetime. So what does the 1954 Hague Convention ask us to do? And I'm not going to go through this in a great deal of detail, but to protect lists of cultural property, to identify them under three different levels: general, special, or enhanced, to put in place emergency plans, to designate competent authorities, to mark protected cultural property with the Blue Shield emblem, the emblem of the 54 Convention, and the logo of my organization, and to put into place the military obligations in Article 7 of the Convention. Now, a couple of years ago, it was the 70th anniversary of the Hague Convention. And so we asked the high contracting parties to the convention, 135, I think it was at the time, had they properly implemented it? Had they identified it under the three different levels? Had they got good inventories? Had they prepared their cultural property and the institutions as required under the 54 Convention? And had they implemented Article 7? And it was a salutary exercise, because the answers were like that. Essentially, there are hardly any countries who have implemented the convention even remotely properly. And failing to do that leaves the country who may be being attacked at a massive disadvantage. The Hague Convention, and it says it 8 times in the convention: in times of peace, X must be done. In times of peace, Y must be done. And these things simply are not done. I say that there are probably only 2 countries in the world who have properly implemented the Hague Convention. The Swiss, because they always do, and the South Koreans, because they have a major threat just to their north. Sadly, 2 other countries are very close to that now. Lebanon, because they have had so much practice over the recent years, and Ukraine, with their practice, unfortunately. But I was with colleagues from Ukraine this afternoon, and they were very open to admitting that they realized that a lot of cultural property that needn't have been lost was lost because they were not ready for the conflict, because they had not implemented the convention properly. So, to the Blue Shield. The Blue Shield comprises 4 elements, and brought together, they are the General Assembly of the Blue Shield. So firstly, the board of the Blue Shield, and that is made up of 4 representatives of the founding 4 organizations that you can see there: ICA, ICOM, ICOMOS, and IFLA, archives, museums, monuments and sites, and libraries, and 4 representatives of national committees of the Blue Shield, and there are now 34 of those globally. And also, the last bit of the Blue Shield is the small bit currently funded through my UNESCO chair, the Blue Shield International. And we envisage Blue Shield now as a triangle set within a circle. It sounds a little naff, but it works. So as with all good triangles, there are 3 points. And those are 3 different sectors, all who start from completely different places, but who have a similar end aspiration in that Blue Shield language: the development or maintenance of healthy, peaceful, stable, secure, sustainable communities. So those 3 points are the heritage sector, the humanitarian sector, and the uniform sector. So not only armed forces, but defense organizations, border and custom controls, police, and other similar organizations. And the space within the triangle is where those 3 sectors can discuss how to go about better cultural protection. Because if you don't have all of them helping, you will not get good CPP, cultural property protection. The heritage sector cannot do this on its own. It has to have the other two there. The conversation in the triangle is heavily impacted by activity in the outer circle. So the political situation, are the political leaders of one or all of the belligerents to a conflict going to abide by international humanitarian law and try to protect that cultural property, or are they going to use it as an excuse for the war, a weapon and a target in the war? Because that, how the political context is established, will have a major impact on what can be discussed and what can happen within the triangle, as does the legal aspect. Who has ratified what international conventions, what national law is there in place? The media or propaganda aspect in the outer circle, I've already described in relation to the Al-Aqshiri Mosque. And then down at the bottom, the communities and how they react and work together. Are they going to continue living happily side by side, or are they going to turn on each other and fight each other and destroy each other's cultural property? So the international NGO, first established in '96, is now established under Dutch law with 35 national committees, predominantly voluntary, and we are an independent, impartial, neutral, non-for-profit. And the biggest thing that we do, I think, is raising awareness and building bridges and building partnerships. So the image on the left-hand side is my predecessor, Karl Habsburg, signing an MOU with the Director General of the International Committee of the Red Cross, Yves Dacour, in 2020. The last thing that Karl and I did together before COVID put a stop to a lot of activity. So that's working with one of the other sectors. In the other image, my colleague, Dr. Emma Cunliffe, is working on a tabletop exercise with planners from NATO, a multinational force. And what Emma's doing is putting cultural property problems into their military planning. And what we're trying to do there, and it's a very slow burn, it's a peacetime activity, but is to get the military to understand that protecting cultural property is just as important to their military campaign as where the logistics for where the ammunition and how the ammunition is going to get to the front line. We ask all of our national committees and Blue Shield internationally to plan to and report on 6 areas of activity, as we call them. You can read them there. I'm not going to go through them all, but we ask all of the national committees to look at those and prioritize them in relation to their own national perspective. And they don't have to do all of them. They may only have time, expertise, staff to do 1 or 2 of them. But by using the same framework, it shows to outsiders that there is a coherent organization. And in the same way, the image there is of me talking at a course that we've now run with the UN training school in Ireland over the last 7 years, a multinational training course of cultural property protection for peacekeepers. That continues. And we also have 8 threats to cultural property. When I first got involved in this, all my friends said, Pete, forget it, it's war. Things get damaged because it's collateral damage. Well, yes, collateral damage is there, but there are 7 other aspects of threat to cultural property. If all 8 are addressed in peacetime, with plans developed in peacetime, you can significantly lower the risk. And there's Blue Shield France working on doing just that. Some of the work that we do, you see my now ex-colleague, Michael de la Cruz, he's moved on, but working to support NATO exercises on a variety of levels. I can't go into that detail, I haven't got the time, but supporting similar training in many European countries, but also Fiji, Honduras with multinational militaries, the annual UN training that I mentioned, but also a similar course in Kilkis in Greece that we contribute to. We worked to protect the cultural workers critically and cultural property in Afghanistan, developing MOUs that you saw with the ICRC, other links with major international organizations, NATO, with UNIFIL, the UN peacekeeping force in Lebanon, and projects at the moment that we are involved in, which is where some of that 500,000 euros comes from, projects in Ukraine, Iraq, and Syria. And again, raising awareness since 2017, 50 plus presentations in over 27 countries. And to come to the issue of new technologies, I'm not an expert in new technologies. And so the way I'm just going to approach the last few minutes of this is thinking about the issues that need technological solutions that we face in a way. One of the issues is digital inventories. You saw in the reaction where we saw that very few countries had properly implemented the convention, that many didn't even have paper-based inventories for their collections. Those all need to be digital, and so that they can be safeguarded. There is a question, of course, if you put those inventories on the internet, how easily they can be hacked into. And that comes to cyber attack, which I'll mention again in a moment. The second issue is using modern technology for on-site data collection. And the image there is of a colleague from Blue Shield Turkey in 2023, following the earthquakes in Turkey. And what they used there was an integrated mobile LiDAR technology on that post-earthquake damage. And that technology allows taking 3D coordinates very rapidly to do a whole building in about an hour. And then from that 3D replication of the building to have an immediate plan of what is needed to stabilize the building, so that at some point in the future, if the rubble from the building is properly collected that relates to that building and not the building next to it, then at some point in the future, that can be restored. And going back to partnership, there is Blue Shield Turkey working there, but working closely with the Istanbul Technical University to do that work. We are also, with funding from the Center for Emergency Response in the Netherlands and from the government of Armenia, we have helped an NGO called Biladi in Lebanon do 3D capture of 3 significant heritage sites in the south of Lebanon, and which were damaged last year in the Israeli attacks on southern Lebanon. The reason I'm not mentioning the names of those sites or showing you anything of those is that at the same time, those sites have been attacked again. And we think definitely in one of those places, there is now nothing of that site left at all. And we fear that there may be nothing left of any of the 3 of them. And as a result, that 3D capture is the only record of those 3 places. To go back to cyber attack, I was made an insomniac for about a week with a colleague who is a specialist in cyber attacks, who in front of me on his laptop hacked into a national museum within about 2 minutes. I won't say which national museum it was, but he said it would take another 2 minutes for him to have hacked into the inventory and the catalogues of that museum, and to have replaced all of the provenance that said this object comes from country A to say this object comes from country B. And as a cyber person, he used the phrase, and the beauty of that is that nobody in the museum will realize until somebody asks to borrow that object for an exhibition somewhere else. Because curators in their own museum hardly ever look at the inventory. And when somebody asks to borrow it, they will say, oh, I thought that came from country A, but the inventory says it's from country B, so it must be. And you have that potential in about a 4-minute cyber attack operation, which is completely unknown that it's happened. And then there are the whole aspects of AI, which, put overly simply makes things quicker and easier to do, both positively and unfortunately negatively. And this year is the 30th anniversary of the establishment of the Blue Shield in '96. And in October, we're holding a 2-day conference in Athens, looking at the past, present, and future of this. And this technology aspect will be a major part of the future. Of course, the world isn't an equal place. And the new technology that my colleague there, Hamady Gay, the chair of the Blue Shield National Committee in Senegal, the new technology that he would have liked before a fire ripped through the university archive that he is walking through, and that holds quite a lot of the political archive in Senegal, was a fire alarm and a fire extinguisher. And that's where we are with the issues. So the future, my last slide, we have a fundraising plan to replace the university money that ends on the 31st of December 27. By that point, we plan to have a team of at least 4 staff in, we hope, 1 central office. That may not have materialized by the end of 27, but by 2030, we aspire to have a team of 14 or more. And that will enable us to move what we've done with NATO and other aspects that I've talked about to a global framework. And we've already had first funding for that central team. The UK has given funding for a 4-year period to fund 1 member of staff, and we've got smaller amounts in from Armenia, Greece, the UAE, a foundation, and some more. And we have a review that's going on, which we refer to as the Fulfilling Potential Review, because of the successes. That amount of money coming in requires a whole different level of auditing and everything like that, but also the threats that we have of perhaps not making those financial fundraising plans by the required dates. So we're looking at the governance, the management, all of our processes and procedures, so that we will be able to attract that necessary external funding. But there is still a very, very long way to go. And this is the future. These are predominantly archaeology and architecture students in Lebanon, helping not only at the end after the explosion at the port, but helping at the moment to protect cultural property across the country. Thank you. IOANNIS, you're muted.
Thank you very much, Peter, for this useful information. Any discussions will be taking place at the end of these three speakers. So we follow with the next speaker, Professor Thomas Levy, Distinguished Professor, Graduate Division, Inaugural Holder, Norma Kershaw Chair, Co-Director, Center for Cyber-Archaeology and Sustainability, Qualcomm Institute, University of California, San Diego, on the topic Cultural Heritage at Risk, the impact of new technologies in the Middle East. Professor Levy is a leading international scholar in the cyber-archaeology and archaeological science. I have had the privilege to collaborate with him at the STRLIC project near Delphi, a late Mycenaean settlement, as well as in other interdisciplinary cultural heritage projects for the last 13 years. His work has been especially influential in applying advanced digital technologies to the study and protection of heritage at risk. Tom, the podium is yours.
Thank you so much, Yannis, and thank you to the Academy for inviting me. And I think a lot of the things I'm going to say are going to intersect with what Peter presented, but I'm not part of the political world. I'm really a dirt archaeologist. So I'm looking at it from the ground up, and my collaborations are really between peoples and not so much on organizations. And the highest organizational level I get at is really collaborating with different universities around the Eastern Mediterranean. And there are many World Heritage sites around the globe that UNESCO recognizes. And even with a recognition like that, it doesn't necessarily protect them from conflict, as Peter pointed out. And I'd just like to mention that back in 2016, ISIS, the Islamic State, destroyed Iraq's oldest Christian monastery. And this was confirmed with satellite imagery. We saw it. This is an image from about 2015. And then on January 20th, 2016, the whole place was leveled. And so this was really an effort on the part of ISIS to erase Christian heritage in the Middle East. And that is indeed the kinds of conflicts that go on. Now, at my home university, we have a major center, the Qualcomm Institute, for integrating the many different fields in the goal of taking advantage of the digital revolution. And so this is where we work, and this is where we try to bring scholars not only from our university but other universities to collaborate with us. Our students, especially our undergraduate students, are very much a part of it, and they help us push the envelope with new technologies, because these young people are so talented, as you all know, if you have young students. And one of our programs collaborates with National Geographic. It's called the Future Engineers for Exploration, and they help solve cultural heritage data collection problems with faculty. And so they're an important part of our work. And they have different student groups, like the Virtual Reality Club, which has about 300 student members, and they provide access to different kinds of scientific visualization tools, head-mounted displays that people like to use, like Oculus Rift, Google Cardboards, HTC Vibes, and other things. And these kids are just awesome. Funding for cultural heritage, digital cultural heritage, is really a challenge. And I think you folks are extremely fortunate, actually, because of the ERC program. And for us in the States, it's very challenging. I mean, NSF has funded our research. Our university system, the University of California, actually awarded me and my group a large grant for 3D digital preservation for at-risk global cultural heritage. And so we brought together 4 different UC universities who work in Egypt, Israel, Jordan, Greece, and some other countries in the Eastern Mediterranean, and we're able to develop techniques of quick data collection methods in the field, and so on. And we turn to private foundations as well. And I think these are issues that really revolve around the problem of data dissemination. How do we keep it out there for the public? And then the longevity, like how are we going to host all these data into the future? I spent 20 years working in the field in Israel, and then 20 years working in the field in Jordan. And over the last, well, let's say 30 years, starting with the work in Jordan was really a catalyst for developing different kinds of digital technologies for archaeological field work. And the area we work in is one of the biggest ancient copper resource zones in the Eastern Mediterranean. It's called Henan in Jordan. And the region is about 250 square kilometers, and it's under threat because the government of Jordan wants to restart copper production in this amazing archaeological landscape. So it's a challenge. And this is so during our field work in Jordan, we were one of the first projects to become totally paperless, a digital project. And here you can see this is really a model just showing what it's a little imaginative because you have Laura Croft there and Indiana Jones, but you get the idea that our on-site lab can process 3D data collected by drone technology or helium balloons with high definition photography, LiDAR, the kind of scanning devices Peter alluded to, and 3D scanners for artifacts and photogrammetry and so on. So we published this back in 1999 with the Society of American Archaeology. But this is a model that I presented to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences back in 2013 that kind of summarizes what we do. We have digital data acquisition in the upper left, the curation of data, which is all geospatial. It's all based on a geospatial database, X, Y, and Z coordinates. And so all data is sort of put into that system for GIS, a Geographic Information System. And these are the things that archaeologists and cultural heritage management people can identify with and organize their data. And then we have digital data analyses with visual analytics, crowdsourcing to involve the public in our exploits, and then the dissemination of digital data through regular publication, peer-reviewed journals, but also in 3D environments and on the across the internet and with 3D visualization platforms that I'll show just a little bit about. But what we have is we do a lot of work on aerial and underwater imaging because we work on the land and beneath the sea. And here you can see the drone technology here, underwater, uh, uh, an array of high definition cameras on an underwater scooter so that large areas can be surveyed. This is something we developed in Greece. And then balloon technology, which we used a lot of because at the time in Jordan, they didn't want us to use drones, very sensitive. And now, as drones become even more important on the war front, I think cultural heritage folks are going to have to reconsider using balloon technologies, which are less threatening to various governments. Another technology that we're developing now, especially with my co-director, Neil Smith at the Qualcomm Institute, is something we call historic metahumans. These are really for helping to tell the cultural stories of heritage around the world. So we started off by recreating a metahuman of a very famous biblical archaeologist named Avram Biran, who's been dead for about 20 years, and we resurrected him using 3D techniques. These are artificial intelligence platforms. You can buy, they're Llama 4 and metahumans, which is a tool for creating realistic digital humans. And then using large language models, we can train these avatars to tell the cultural heritage story to the public. And so we started with him, this famous archaeologist, but then we also made one of Mahatma Gandhi, um, and and there are issues about, when you do these kinds of avatar and meta-human building. Um, we also do a lot of paleo-environmental reconstructions around the sites that we work to study climate and environmental change and how it affects cultures through time. And this involves what we can call 4D reconstructions, that is X, Y, and Z, and then time, the time variable, and I'll show you how this works. And so here on the left, we can see maritime geophysical techniques, shallow geophysics. These are the transect lines that provide the data for making these kinds of reconstructions. There you can see it there, excuse me. And here we can see the how we can pull that data together and create these different time slices of the environment. And then using our metahuman, we can have a guide who you see there on the right. And then we can go through what did the Neolithic landscape look like based on our sediment cores, and then pulling all the data together. What did it look like in the Bronze Age when there were wetlands in this area? And then the changing levels of the sea and how that impacted different harbors in the area. And this kind of data is especially useful along the coast of Israel and Lebanon and Syria. we also this is the newer work that I'm highlighting. We have different kinds of visualization systems. We have the Cyber-Archaeology Warehouse. It's a virtual metaverse platform that's developed by Neil and our students. It's designed for collaborative archaeological research, education, and the preservation through immersive digital environments. Then we have a digital classroom where it's possible for a virtual interactive educational platform using this CyberArk warehouse metaverse to facilitate global access. So a research group sitting in Athens or in Haifa or in Amman can have access to this data, and we can all sit in the digital classroom together and examine artifacts and look at it. And then we have digital uh, city twins. And this really ties in with archaeology because it's using these advanced technologies to preserve and interact with cultural heritage. And so we create a virtual replica of an archaeological site with artifacts using tools like 3D modeling, LiDAR, photogrammetry, and AI to create these environments. And here you can see uh, we have the Digital Archaeology Atlas of the Holy Land, which really extends from Lebanon to southern Syria to Israel, the Palestinian areas, Jordan, and then down into Sinai, with over 50,000 archaeological sites in the atlas served up over a Google Earth platform that people can access and exchange, interact with the data. And then the actual artifact data is based on 3D scans of artifacts using photogrammetry, and that enables people to do 3D printing of these artifacts. These are some of the regions that our center works with across North Africa, all the way down to Ethiopia and the Middle East, the different kinds of projects, all their cultural heritage, they're all rooted in applying these digital technologies. And so, again, it's about uh, data acquisition, the dissemination of archaeological data, the curation, and there are challenges like for computer scientists, like how do we move these really big cultural heritage data sets that we collect between research institutions? And we have the University of California at UC San Diego is developing the Pacific Research Platform for it's a fiber network, which also involves a number of European universities that facilitates the sharing of data. And we also have collaborations with KAUST, King Abdullah University of Science and Technology in Saudi Arabia, where our group actually built a digital scientific visualization lab for them under my colleague Tom DeFonte. And now I'd like to just give one example of a data collection project that we did that was really stimulated by the destruction of St. Elias's monastery in Iraq. And so we went, there are three really old uh, Greek monasteries in the Middle East. The second most important and oldest would be Marsaba in the Judean desert of Israel, Palestine, and the other one is Santa Catarina in Sinai. And these places are always in danger of being destroyed. So here you can see our Kidron Valley project, located just to the east of the Dead Sea. Of the Dead Sea over here. Here's the Dead Sea. And we're going to look at applying an economic model from the Milken Institute in Los Angeles to creating what we're tentatively calling heritage asset districts, to encourage local peoples to see the value of their cultural heritage and encourage them to want to save it, along the lines that Peter was talking about. So one of the ways to define the actual area is based on the natural watershed of an area. And then we want to create high value attractions capable of bringing visitors to the district. Obviously, this is under peacetime. Sharing of costs and revenues throughout the district by different ethnic groups, if you like, different religious groups, and so on. And then financing it ultimately by creating incremental value to strengthen the attractions and bring more people there. So this valley is very important. It starts right near the Temple Mount in Jerusalem and flows to the Dead Sea. Unfortunately, it's been polluted by Palestinians, by Israelis, everybody. And one of our mottos is sewage flows where pilgrims once trod in Israel, Palestine. And another idea is peace through sewage. So if we clean it up, if we find ways to solve this problem, it'll bring communities together. And there's about 350,000 people that live in the Kidron Valley today. But this is an area that over 3.5 billion people, Muslims, Christians, Jews, they care about this. They care about it. And here's a 3D view of the watershed that you see here. This is the old city of Jerusalem, and the Kidron flows down through here, and the Marsaba Monastery is there. And let's take a look at that monastery. It was built in 483 AD. And again, at the time that we did this research, we could not bring drones into the country. So we used our helium balloon system that you see here. This is the beautiful Marsaba Monastery that you see there. We brought together Israelis, Palestinians, the Greek church, and our team, Americans. And here you can just see we're getting the balloon system together. And we've got Father IOANNIS over here observing. He gave us permission to do this project. And here you can see some of a single shot of a high definition image shot from the balloon. And then when we've processed like about 1,200 images together, all georeference with Photoscan Agisoft, which is actually a Russian program, really good. We can create these 3D models for cultural heritage preservation. And a number of institutions are doing this, and we can't emphasize how important it is to do that kind of work. And then we can share it. Hopefully, we're going to stimulate young people, especially, to be interested in ancient cultural heritage. And then we can do virtual tours through the individual rooms that we scanned with different kinds of artifacts, and people using gaming technologies can use this. And this is the Pacific Research Platform I mentioned that connects the California university systems in it, but it also extends, as I mentioned, all the way to Europe and so on. So that's what I have to say. And I would just like to reiterate that it's the longevity of all this research that we do that's the big question. How do we keep it going? How do we keep it in the public eye? And how do we make it as available as possible to as many communities as possible? Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you very much for the illuminating presentation. We go on to the third speaker, Professor MATIJA STRLIC, Faculty of Chemistry and Chemical Technology, Heritage Science Laboratory at Ljubljana University, Slovenia. The title will be Protecting the Smells of Cultural Heritage. Professor STRLIC is a leading international scholar in heritage science and analytical chemistry with pioneering work on the material, chemical, and sensory dimensions of cultural heritage. His research has opened new perspectives in how odors, volatile compounds, and material degradation processes can be studied, documented, and preserved as part of our cultural memory. His lecture will highlight the emerging importance of smell as an intangible and material dimension of heritage protection. Dear MATIJA, the point is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor LIRITZIS. Can you just confirm that you see my screen, please?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you for this introduction. And can I just say that it's an immense pleasure to be able to talk to you and the colleagues at on the occasion of this colloquium. And I feel a little bit under pressure following the two talks that we just heard, which were both not just excellent, but also highlighted very important aspects of cultural heritage and their protection. This third talk will focus on a significantly narrower aspect of cultural heritage, but perhaps on an aspect that few of us think about as cultural heritage. But I hope to demonstrate that it is important not just to study and preserve, but also important in terms of our cultural identity, in terms of cultural memory, and in terms of preservation in the long term. In the end, I'm also going to look at how smells could be protected for the future and propose ideas in terms of smell archives. This research has been ongoing for quite a bit of time already. We started looking into the value of smell as a component of cultural heritage probably about 15 years ago, and only recently developed technologies that can be used to not just understand and study smells, but also to reproduce smells for the purpose of engagement and conversation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about all these aspects. I'm really pleased that the president of the Academy mentioned the value of smell of old books, and I'm going to touch on that subject a little bit later in my presentation. But first, I'll focus on a case study that we recently completed in collaboration with the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. This is the old Egyptian Museum in Tahrir Square in the center of Cairo, where we worked with the director of the museum to develop an understanding of the smell of Egyptian mummies, mummified bodies. This turned out to be quite an important study because it highlighted not just the value of smell in terms of interaction with archaeological objects and in terms of interaction specifically between visitors and displays, but also it highlighted how valuable smell is in terms of the understanding of the archaeological and material makeup of objects and in terms of understanding of their conservation. I'll talk a little bit about these aspects, but before that, I'll say a few words about how we actually collect smells for the purpose of analysis and how we analyze them in the laboratory. The technology is not particularly complex. It involves the capture of smells from historic objects, in this particular case, mummified bodies, using either sampling devices called solid phase microextraction devices, or using tubes filled with organic sorbents specifically designed for capturing volatile organic compounds, which represent the compounds that constitute aromas. This is done using pumps, and it's also done entirely non-destructively, so it can be done on what are often quite fragile objects, such as is the case of this particular mummified body in the storage area of the Egyptian Museum. In collaboration with the museum director, we negotiated access to 9 mummified bodies from different periods and different styles, looking at differences between these mummified bodies, not just in terms of their material makeup, but also in terms of their state of conservation. And I'm going to say a few words about this later. The smells, for the purpose of olfactory analysis, in other words, for the purpose of using our noses to detect and analyze them, are collected using specific bags which do not emit volatile organic compounds themselves. These so-called nalophene bags are filled with 20, 30, 50 liters of air from, in this case, from within a sarcophagus, and the air is then smelled by a panel of individual sniffers. We call them smellers. These are people who have been trained to use their nose to recognize different aroma components, in other words, to smell different notes. The notes that constitute the aroma of a historic object depend very much on its material makeup, but also on the way that it degrades. And those notes need to be developed for specific typologies of objects. In other words, a historic book will smell very differently, and we will experience very different notes to a mummified body, as you might imagine. Once these bags are filled, they are presented to our panel, and the panel assesses the notes, their intensity, their pleasantness, in other words, their hedonic tone. Once those notes are identified, in our case, we identified 11 notes associated with archaeological mummies, with Egyptian mummified bodies. Among them were smoky, spicy, woody, moldy, sweet, resin-like, floral, and so on. Once those notes are identified, individual mummified bodies are analyzed, and the panel assesses which notes are more intensively associated with which mummified body. As you can see in this particular slide, I'm showing the spider plots or radar plots for 9 mummified bodies. We see that some are similar, but the majority are quite dissimilar, which means that these different mummified bodies emit different aromas, different aromatic notes, but there are some similarities between them. And we were interested in where those similarities come from, why certain mummified bodies exhibit certain types of smells, such as herbal or floral or citrus-like, and why some of them smell sweet or woody, for example. This can be done using analytical techniques such as gas chromatography, olfactometry, and a colleague of mine here is analyzing, or rather detecting, the smells emitted from this piece of kit, one at a time. A specific aroma can consist of up to 50 or even 80 compounds that can be detected using the human nose, but not all of them are important for the overall aroma. It turns out that typically an aroma can be reproduced using 5, 10, up to 15 aroma components, but other components can be important in certain cases, and it's important to separate them, to understand each individual aroma component, and of course understand its quantity within the aroma, within the bouquet of the aroma, if you like. And this is done using analytical techniques such as this one. Once the aromas are separated, once the volatile organic compounds are separated, here we can see a typical chromatogram of individual aromas on the upper half of the plot. This chromatogram shows compounds such as hexanoic acid or nonanal, which are typically considered to be degradation products associated with biodeterioration, or terpineol, which is a volatile organic compound associated with historical resins. Once we separate the individual compounds, we can also analyze how intensively they smell, and the intensity of these smells is represented on the lower part of the plot. This is the so-called olfactogram. The totality, so the chromatogram and the olfactogram, tells us what chemical compounds are contained within a particular aroma, how intensive they are, how intensively they smell, and what or how those smells can be described, such as sweet or moldy, or smells like apple or oranges, etc., etc. This information is essential to chemically understand and sensorially understand the composition of an individual aroma. With all these compositions at hand, we were able to identify the aromatic makeups of the 9 mummified bodies that we analyzed in our study. And you can see that the differences that were identified using human noses were reflected in the differences in the chemical composition of the aromas of those mummified bodies. We could distinguish 4 categories of smells. The first category of smells were original compound smells. These were associated with rosins that were used in the process of mummification. Very often in ancient Egypt, such huge quantities of rosins and essential oils were added during the mummification process that the mummified bodies still smell very pleasantly, even 2, 3, 4,000 years after mummification. A small number of compounds in blue were associated with biodeterioration. These compounds are a consequence of biodegradation during storage of mummified bodies. In many mummified bodies, these were quite weak, meaning that the museum takes good care of the mummified bodies in their care. Some aroma compounds, particularly those in green, were to our minds and according to our analysis, were added to the mummified bodies during preservation. It turns out that conservators today, during normal preservation practice in Egyptian museums and collections, it turns out that they use the same oils as were used in the process of mummification for the purpose of mummified body preservation. And these were associated with orange oil, with cinnamon oil, for example, and similar compounds, which smell very pleasantly, but of course are later additions to the overall smells of the mummified bodies. And finally, the compounds in gray are chemical pesticides. Those pesticides have no smell, but of course we had to determine them nevertheless because of ethical concerns and health and safety concerns for our analysts. This table shows you, hopefully, the diversity of compounds associated with smells of mummified bodies and our attempt of how to classify them into 4 different groups depending on their origin. Based on these compounds, we were able to classify the mummified bodies into several different groups. And one mummified body number 9, stood out quite nicely, and that's because the intensity of its smell was so high, because it reflected the amount of mummification materials, especially resins and essential oils used during mummification. And the reason why the quantity of those compounds was so high is because this was a person of very high social standing, and for such individuals the quality of the mummification process was better. They used better raw materials for mummification and higher quantities of it. That's why posthumously, these individuals still smell extremely pleasantly and intensively so as well. However, smell is contextual, and the same compound that smells of mold in a cellar, for example, can smell very pleasantly in an autumn forest. Geosmin, for example, which is the smell of mushrooms, can be either smelled pleasantly by the human nose or unpleasantly, depending on the context. And the reason why I'm showing this plot is to remind us that smells are not just contextual, but they depend very much on the environment within which we smell those compounds. Smells are incredibly important to humans as we negotiate the space around us. It has been shown in the past that, of course, humans use sight most of the time as we interact within a particular space. But immediately after sight, the sense of smell is important. Almost half of the time, we use our noses to perceive our environment, perhaps less intellectually so, or perhaps less consciously so than sight, but we do use it most of the time. So smell is extremely important in terms of how we communicate with our environment and how we perceive our environment. And this is also the reason why museums, heritage organizations, tourist organizations today are extremely interested in the understanding of the value of smell to the experience of heritage in heritage environments. In other words, I'm arguing that the sense of smell is equally important to our perception of heritage as the sense of sight or the sound of cultural heritage, if you like, and of course touch and taste. Now, to those of you who have ever been in a historic library, the smell of old books is a very, very pleasant memory. Not many young people still have that memory. And of course, it's a question whether the value of this smell will be as important to young generations as it is perhaps to our generation, because we have that intense experience of this smell. So I'm going to say a few words about the smell of historic books, why it's valuable to people, and how we can preserve it. A few years ago, I worked at the library of St. Paul's Cathedral in central London, and it was filled with old books, obviously, and because it was so full of historical books, leather-bound, it also smelled incredibly intensively of decaying paper and decaying leather. And it was really interesting to look through books where visitors left their impressions, because some of those impressions referred to the experience that the visitors had with the smell of the space. They said that it was possible to inhale knowledge, or that it was possible to smell the history of the place. Excuse me. Which shows how important this experience of intensive smell of books was to visitors. In fact, when I talked to the cathedral architect, who asked us to propose strategies for long-term preservation of this library, he told us that the smell must be retained, whatever strategies we propose, which told us how important the sense of smell was to the curator, to the person in charge of long-term care of this incredible space. The smell of books can be analyzed in the very same way as the smell of mummified bodies, and here we show in a particular diagram, which we call olfactory wheel, we show the typical compounds contained in the smell of books, which are vanillin, which is associated with cellulose degradation, furfural, also associated with cellulose degradation, benzaldehyde, associated with lignin degradation. These are all chemical compounds of historical paper, which is why on the basis of these chemical compounds, we can propose 6 notes associated with historical paper smell, and these notes are sweet, earthy, chemical, rancid, medicinal, floral, and smoky. Now that we know the chemical composition and the sensory notes associated with historical paper, we can think and consider how to preserve these smells. On the one hand, we need to know the chemical composition, and we need to know how our nose interprets the chemical composition into aromas that can be understood by the human brain. On the other hand, we need to know why the smells are important. In other words, we need to know the historical significance of these smells, or the contextual significance of these smells. We have heard from library visitors why the smells are important to them, and we have heard from the cathedral architect why the smells are important to the cathedral management. And finally, we need to understand how to reproduce those smells. In other words, we need a recipe for aroma reproduction, for perfume reproduction, for the purpose of future presentation to potential visitors, now once original smells are potentially gone. And this can be done fairly interestingly within the context of exhibitions. This was an exhibition that was set up at the Bodleian Library in Oxford, where not just our aroma wheel was presented, but where also the smell of historic paper in the form of a perfume was presented to visitors, such that while the books are hidden behind a glass barrier within a display case, the visitor still can have that experience of historic smell of the actual object. And we have, since then, we have reproduced many smells, including, for example, of old perfumes, old paper already, as already mentioned, and we are now in the process of reproducing the smell of mummified bodies for the purpose of engagement within a museum environment, for the purpose of bringing objects closer, and for enriching the experience during an exhibition visit. That smells are an important aspect of the heritage experience has been recognized also by the Bara Charter in 2013, which speaks that the setting of a place is important in terms of recognition of it as cultural heritage. And it speaks of setting in relation to sensory aspects of the setting, such as smells and sounds. So we have regulatory basis for the protection of smells that define cultural heritage, that define a space, an area, a building, or an object as cultural heritage. So regulatory basis is there, and it turns out that certain countries have already started protecting cultural heritage sites because of the value of smells that they bring to audiences and that they bring to individuals and communities associated with those sites. In Japan, the country, or rather individuals within the community, identified 100 sites across the country where typical Japanese smells can be smelled during particular times of year. For example, a typical smell of fish fermentation has been designated as a heritage smell. Of course, cherry tree flowering also produces a typical smell, and those 100 sites have been protected and presented to tourists as part of a scented scenery tourism experience. And in Grasse, in southern France, the historical traditions of perfume making and growing plants for the purpose of perfume industry have been protected within as a UNESCO designated site. We are studying the processes of understanding as well as protection of cultural heritage smells within a series of projects, not just institutional, but also European projects. Ode Europa, for example, was a recently completed project and an investment of close to 4 million euro into the understanding and classification of smells of cultural heritage and their protection. And at University of Ljubljana, where I'm currently based, we just completed an Odoteca site, an Odoteca project developing an archive of cultural heritage smells. How might thus such an archive look like is a good question. In Versailles, close to Paris, in France, obviously, there is already a museum of perfumes. And within this museum of perfumes, you can see a vast collection of several thousand historical perfumes that have been preserved as perfumes for the purpose, for the posterity. In the case of our archive, we are not storing the actual mixtures, the actual perfumes, if you like. What we are storing are context, so the value statements in relation to the historical or other significance of the smells that we think need to be preserved. We are preserving the chemical and sensory information about those smells, and we are preserving the recipes that enable any museum or anyone really to reproduce those smells for the purpose of enriching the tourist and heritage experiences in their museums or in the future. And with this, I will end this presentation, and I thank you again, Ioannis, for your hosting of my talk. Thank you very much. You're muted.
Absorbed so much from your talk. So thank you, all of you. And we heard three talks. One shared concern, the heritage at risk. Professor Stone showed us heritage destroyed by armed conflict and how new technologies can help the Blue Seal protect it as a humanitarian duty. Professor Levy then took us into the field, the Middle East, Greece, and beyond, demonstrating how cyber-archaeology digitally documents and safeguards heritage before it is lost. And Professor STRLIC opened an entirely new frontier, the smell of heritage, in particular in Egyptian mummies and books. Chemistry, volatile compounds, sensory memory, all are part of what we must preserve. What connects those three? First, the risk is a continuum from sudden destruction to slow decay. Second, technology is not optional. It is an ethical tool for documentation and protection. It is law, data, and even smell. Together, these three perspectives demand interdisciplinary action. The question now is, how do we degrade them? So please join me in thanking our speakers once more, and let us begin the discussion. Any question?
I have a question, Ioannis.
Okay, Tom, yes.
For Peter, if you could please explain the relationship between Blue Shield and UNESCO. Do they listen to you? Do they make it a priority?
Thank you. Yes, we work fairly closely with UNESCO. We overlap perhaps a little bit too much. We perhaps need to clarify where both organizations have their expertise a bit more precisely, but that's down to both organizations. But so simply, we work with them. They are the custodians of the 54 Convention and the protocols. They provide the Secretariat for the Intergovernmental Committee on Cultural Property Protection in the event of armed conflict. But we can occasionally do things that UNESCO can't because they are part of the UN, essentially, political system. Because we're independent, impartial, and neutral, we have that flexibility of being outside that system. We're not there yet. We don't have the credibility of the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross. But I always say if we don't start on that path, we're never going to get that credibility. And so one of the key things is that we will not criticize any party to any conflict. We will work with any party to any conflict if they are willing and ready to try and protect cultural property during that conflict.
I thought one of the most useful projects that you presented was speaking to the NATO forces. I've spoken to the American Navy, and the issue was actually wanted to speak to the common soldiers.
Yeah.
And they always, I don't know how it worked with NATO, but they always want you to speak to the officers. I was wondering, how did it work for you?
We get to talk not as much with NATO, because most of the work that we do with NATO, excuse me, is on their exercises, where we're training the officers who make decisions. As I think I said, we're training them to see the protection of cultural property as equally important to how they get the ammunition to the front line. But with some of the work that we've done with peacekeepers, we have got down, perhaps not to the private soldier, but certainly to fairly junior NCO ranks, because it's those characters who are perhaps leading a foot patrol through a sensitive area. There was one example where there had been a handover between units in UNIFIL, two different countries, one leaving and one taking over. The handover hadn't been as detailed as we would aspire. In other words, the first country had left before the second one arrived, and so there was almost no handover. And the second country started putting in patrols, but put patrols on the wrong day at the wrong time. So they would have a fairly heavy militarized patrol of 3 or 4 vehicles going past a mosque on a Friday at noonday prayers. And that just was exactly the wrong thing to do. But that got down to the fairly junior NCO to realize that and to try and modify it. So you can get to that level, but you also get to the level of a reality in an armed conflict, as opposed to a peacekeeping deployment, where if there is live ammunition whizzing through the air, anybody is going to hide behind the nearest wall, whether that wall is an ancient one or a modern one. And that's just human nature. And they'd have to push me out of the way if I was anywhere close, because I would be the first person behind that ancient wall.
Okay, next question is by Ordwin Wren. Hello, Ordwin.
Hello, hi.
Our member of Academy.
Yeah, well, thank you. First, the 3 speakers were very fascinating and very stimulating talks. I was really very impressed by all, your presentations. I have a question about the data. I mean, you have collected a lot of data, you analyze data, you build kind of new data platforms and data banks. And who is the owner of the data? I think we always have the danger of, colonizing now the countries again by having access to data and then not sharing them. Is this all open access, or is it something? And how is the cooperation with the host countries? And I think specifically, you said that you were cooperating with the museums and so on. But the question of ownership, I think, is an interesting one. In the sense of, it's not the artifact itself, but even its whatever twin, it's a data twin might be very interesting and might be a very precious thing after a while. And I would like, to get your answer about this. Is there an agreement on data sharing? Is there agreement on data ownership?
That's a great question, and it really varies from country to country. And I think that's a really important thing for us to remember, that there's no uniform way of thinking about the ownership of cultural heritage. Um, for example, in this country, in America, the Native American tribes have a lot of control over the distribution of their artifacts, hard artifacts, and virtual data. And every tribe has their own take on it, depending on their experience, positive and negative with the central government or with the universities. And then on the country level, like Jordan, for example, Jordan, I think, is a very unique place because if you're an archaeologist associated with a university, you have an institution behind you. The Jordan doesn't have the financial wherewithal to curate all the artifacts that come out of the ground. And so they will say to archaeologists from whatever country, we want to have the museum quality artifacts, the reconstructible pots and so on. And we want to keep that in our national archive. But all the other artifacts you can take to your home university if you have the space and the facilities to host it, and we will maintain ownership of it, but we will give it to you on permanent loan forever. But we have the ownership of the cultural data.
Mhm.
That's really unusual. And but they will let us, there's no issues about the like hosting the actual virtual art digital scans and so on.
Mhm.
And the same like in Israel, if you dig a site, the archaeologist has full control over those particular artifacts that they excavated. They belong to the state, and it's very difficult to get them out of the country. You need, every country, you need permission. But that said, you have full control over that data. Greece is very, very, it's more difficult to have access and to share virtual data. You need more and more permissions there than any other country that I've experienced. And we did a nice project with the museum in Kalamata where we did virtual scans of everything on display. And we wanted to create a virtual museum, but it was very difficult just because of the history of the way antiquities were stolen out of their country and so on. So there's no single answer to it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there an
Thank you.
international agreement somewhere? I mean, is there something like whatever, or an international arrangement that you can refer to, or is it really for each country differently?
My gut feeling, and I'm not uh, I'm not part of those big committees like Peter. I mean, Peter might be able to answer that better than me, honestly.
Well, thank you. I mean, essentially, there is some guidance at an international legal level, but it comes down to national law in 99% of the situation, as you've been saying. From our point of view as Blue Shield, we facilitate some of that data collection, as I say, because we helped with, or the Lebanese got the funding from the Center for Emergency Response. We got some money from the Armenians who wanted to help Lebanon. So we were able to combine that, but all of that data stays with the Lebanese. We don't want to keep that data. We don't have the facility to keep that data, but we have a real interest in that data being preserved because, as I said, unfortunately, it looks highly likely that the 3 sites where that data was captured in southern Lebanon are no longer. So that's the record. And from my perspective, that record, without question, has to sit with the Lebanese.
Thank you.
Another question by Riccardo Poggio from Rome.
Can I just very briefly address the question as well, if that's okay, Ioannis?
Yes, of course.
Thank you, and apologies, Ricardo. I just wanted to say a few words about research data, which I think was part of the question as well. At least in Europe, publicly funded research projects need to openly share data. And Europe is investing quite a bit of money into joint data repositories for cultural heritage data. There is obviously Europeana as a data aggregator for cultural heritage. It started as a shared archive or as a shared European digital library, but it has started to ingest larger and more complex data files such as 3D scans and similar. There's obviously a lot of national initiatives as well, which are becoming aggregated on international level, which means that it is now possible to search for data files from a single entry point across aggregated data repositories, which is a very significant advancement. In terms of understanding data and analyzing data, there are further significant investments that enable us to understand, visualize, and present data that are being funded through the European Collaborative Cloud for Cultural Heritage, which is a further 70 million investment, I believe, into tools as well as repositories for the purpose of those tools and for the purpose of management of cultural heritage data that has been generated through research and digitization projects. One aspect of more recent data that is being intensively studied legally is related to intellectual property and related to copyright specifically, because digitized objects that are copyright protected cannot be made publicly available generally publicly available, but they can be made publicly available for the purpose of research. So there are legal issues with respect to data, even if it has been publicly generated.
Well, thank you.
Ricardo.
Yes, thank you. Just a quick question to MATIJA. Hello, nice to see you again. You see, 10 years ago, we moved an historic library, 800 volumes, so the oldest 1516, here it is, and the youngest 1840. Yes, 1840. We moved it from a Venetian villa to our apartment in Rome. Now the smell is gone. What can I do to retrieve it?
Some conservator would say that that's good news because some of the compounds within the smell of old books contribute to their own degradation. So books degrade autocatalytically, if I'm allowed to speak as a chemist. But what very often happens is that objects smell more intensively in hotter environments, and less intensively in colder environments. I'm not entirely sure how your villa and your flat compare in terms of heat and in terms of temperature, but very often we can intensify the smell if the object is slightly warmer. That's one possibility. The other possibility is obviously to keep objects in enclosed environments so that the volatile organic compounds that constitute their smell cannot dissipate as freely. So keeping them in cupboards, for example, or in obviously not at home, but in a museum, in a display case, will intensify the perceived smell. So intensive ventilation obviously contributes to dissipation of smells.
Good, thank you.
Very welcome, Ricardo. Good to see you here.
Any other question?
One quick question to MATIJA on the smell research. You know, when we dig an archaeology site, we deal with what we would call formation processes of the archaeological record. Like what we dig is not what really existed 6,000 years ago. There are, you know, natural formation processes that affect what we find. And I wonder, do you have to extract like any kind of recent smells or anything to get down to what you're interested in?
There is a couple of really interesting studies looking at perceived smells during archaeological excavations. And I haven't done this research myself, but I'd really like at some point to record smells that are present during excavation and not later anymore, because those smells dissipate very quickly. So this is just an aside. But what I'm particularly interested in are current smells of historical objects, which are a composite, which are a combination of smells that existed before. For example, in terms of mummies, these would be mummification products such as essential oils and etc., as well as their degradation products through millennia of storage and burial. Those degradation products have their own smells. So what we smell today is a combination of the original smell and of all the decay products. And as a chemist, I'm interested in that decay chemistry. And I'm interested in what that tells me about the conservation of the object. But I'm equally interested, from perhaps an archaeological point of view, what those smells tell us about the original composition of the object. So, as it turns out in our mummy study, both is sometimes possible.
Anybody else? Any question? No questions?
No.
Okay, so I once more thank our three speakers and the participants, and I would like to remind that our next colloquium, which is the last one or the first round, is on 27th of May on looting of cultural treasures. How easy is it today to rob a museum or illegally excavate an antiquity? Speaker is Dr. Alexander Herman, Director of the Institute of Art and Law at UK. Thank you very much and have a nice evening.